I heard it through the haze, machines beeping, nurses whispering, a doctor's voice tense with urgency. Then came the sentence that cracked something deep inside me. Let her die. My son's voice. Cold, final. I couldn't speak, couldn't sit up, couldn't scream. I just lay there, oxygen hissing beside me, knowing the boy I once rocked to sleep had sentenced me like I was already gone. After all the sacrifices, all the years, I wasn't his mother anymore. I was an inconvenience. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The late afternoon sun glared off the glass storefronts of downtown Cleveland, bouncing harshly against the pavement. Marjorie had been walking home from the market, her small grocery bag slung over one arm, when the dizziness struck. At first it was just a tilt in her vision, a sway she thought she could shake off. But the ground pitched sharply, and before she could catch herself, she was on the cold concrete, groceries spilling across the sidewalk. A young man nearby dropped his coffee and ran over. "Ma'am? Hey, ma'am, are you okay?" His voice cracked with urgency. He fumbled for his phone, dialing with trembling fingers. "Yeah, 911. A woman collapsed on Euclid, right outside the bakery. She's breathing, but hurry." Marjorie's eyes fluttered, the sky spinning above her. Sirens rose in the distance, weaving through city noise, growing louder by the second. The world blurred into fragments, the heat of the pavement seeping into her palms, the acrid scent of gasoline from passing traffic, the sharp edge of fear pressing into her ribs. Minutes later, paramedics surrounded her. Latex gloves snapped, a mask pressed over her face, cool air rushing in. "Stay with us, ma'am," one urged. She couldn't answer, only drift. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic and metal, bright with fluorescent lights that stabbed her eyes even through half-lids. Dr. Harris Cole, broad-shouldered and calm under pressure, leaned over her with steady hands. "BP dropping. Let's stabilize." He barked instructions, the team moving around him with precision. 4 inches oxygen steady. Heart monitor beeping, erratic, but alive. Once her vitals steadied, doctor. Cole pulled her file. Emergency contact. Daniel Whitman, son. He dialed, expecting concern, urgency, anything. On the second ring, a man's voice answered, clipped and irritated. "Yeah? This is Doctor Cole from Cleveland General. Your mother's been admitted after collapsing. She's stable now, but we need—" A sharp laugh, humorless and cold, cut him off. "What do you want me to do about it?" "Let her die," the words dropped like a blade. Silence followed, heavy and wrong. A nurse standing nearby froze, her pen hovering above a chart. She stared at the phone in disbelief, then at Dr. Cole, who kept his tone professional despite the disgust tightening his jaw. "I'll document the call," he said quietly, ending the line. The nurse exhaled shakily, scribbling notes with trembling hands. "He really said that?" she whispered. Dr. Cole nodded grimly. "Every word." "We'll make sure it's recorded back in the recovery bay." Machines beeped softly around Marjorie, her breathing shallow but steady. Hours blurred as she drifted in and out, voices muffled at the edge of her awareness. She caught pieces, nurses updating charts, footsteps shuffling past, the faint squeak of wheels against linoleum. Then, as evening fell and the hallway quieted, she heard it. 2 voices, low but clear enough. "I couldn't believe it," the nurse said, her tone edged with disbelief. "The son." The doctor called him, told him she'd collapsed. You know what he said? He told us to just let her die. Marjorie's eyes snapped open, her heart hammering against the monitors. The beeping quickened, loud in the sterile room. Her throat felt tight, air catching as though the betrayal itself had stolen her breath. Her own son, her Daniel, the boy she had raised through scraped knees and late-night study sessions, the man she had defended more times than she could count. He had answered the call and wished her gone. Marjorie lay still, tears burning her eyes as the reality sank like ice through her veins. The monitors kept her alive, but the words she'd overheard cut deeper than any illness. And in that moment, weak but wide awake, she knew her life would never return to what it had been before that call. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the dim hospital room, a rhythm that should have comforted her. Instead, each tone felt like a reminder that she was alive in spite of her own son's indifference. Marjorie lay against stiff white pillows, tears sliding soundlessly into her hairline. The salt burned the corner of her mouth, mixing with the bitter taste of oxygen tubing. She replayed it again, the nurse whispering in disbelief, the exact phrasing lodged in her chest. Let her die. Daniel hadn't stumbled over the words or hesitated. He'd said them like a fact, a dismissal, as if her life was just a line item to cross off. The curtain swished softly, and Dr. Harris Cole stepped in. His presence filled the small room, not imposing but solid, like an anchor against the storm she was drowning in. He pulled up a chair, his expression grim but kind. "Mrs. Whitman," he said gently, folding his hands. "I don't want to repeat what you overheard, but I need you to understand." He made himself clear. And when family speaks like that, we as doctors, we have to consider more than just medicine. Her throat tightened. She turned her face toward the window where the Cleveland skyline glittered faintly beyond glass, streaked with condensation. "I raised him," she whispered. "I sacrificed for him. And he told you to let me die." Dr. Cole leaned forward, his voice steady. "Which is why you need protection. Not medically, we'll take care of that, but legally, financially, so no one like him can control your future again." Marjorie wiped her eyes with the corner of the blanket, her fingers trembling but her resolve sharp. "He'll never touch another penny of mine." Not after this. Before Dr. Cole could reply, the door burst open and a familiar voice filled the room. "Grandma!" Grace rushed to her bedside, her breathless urgency tinged with fear. She dropped her backpack on the floor, the thud loud against the sterile quiet, and clasped Marjorie's hand with both of hers. "I came as soon as I heard," she said, her voice shaking. Marjorie managed a weak smile, squeezing her granddaughter's hand. "You shouldn't be here this late. Don't they have finals coming up?" "I don't care about finals right now." Grace's eyes brimmed with tears. She tried to blink away. "Dad didn't even call me, Grandma. I found out online. Someone posted about you being taken to the hospital." Her voice cracked, anger flaring through her grief. "He didn't think I deserved to know." The words stung, but they didn't surprise Marjorie. She stroked the back of Grace's hand, her voice softer but edged with steel. "Then you know why things will change. He may not value me, but I value you." Grace bent down, resting her forehead gently against Marjorie's arm. "I'll never forgive him for this," she whispered. Marjorie's tears slipped again, not of weakness, but of clarity. For years she had ignored the signs. Daniel's impatience, Sophie's smugness, the way they spoke of her home and savings like assets already promised. She had wanted to believe time would soften them, that loyalty would outweigh greed. But tonight, lying under hospital lights, she understood the truth. Daniel had already buried her in his mind. Dr. Cole cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Whitman, I can recommend someone. A lawyer who specializes in cases like this, protecting seniors from exploitation. His name's Alan Pierce. He's relentless. If you want to make sure your son never touches your estate, he's the one." Marjorie turned her head, locking eyes with the doctor. Her voice was raspy, but her words were iron. "Give me his number." The monitor beeped steadily beside her, each tone no longer just a reminder she was alive, but a promise. She wasn't finished yet. The strip mall law office looked unassuming from the outside. Sand-colored brick, narrow windows, a faded sign that read Alan Pierce, attorney at law. To most people, it was just another storefront wedged between a tax service and a dry cleaner. To Marjorie, walking slowly with her cane, it felt like the entrance to a fortress. Inside, the reception area was warm and tidy. the faint scent of coffee and polished wood softening the sharpness of the fluorescent lights. A young assistant greeted her with a smile, then guided her into a corner office. Alan Pierce rose from behind a heavy oak desk. He was broad-shouldered, his suit well-tailored but practical, the kind of man who carried authority without theatrics. He extended a hand, his grip firm, his eyes sharp behind rectangular glasses. "Mrs. Whitman," he said, motioning toward a leather chair. "Dr. Cole told me to expect you. Please sit." Marjorie lowered herself carefully, her cane resting against the armrest. She placed her folder of documents on the desk. Old wills, bank statements, notes scribbled in her own handwriting. Her voice quivered at first, but steadied as she spoke. "My son," she began, "was called when I collapsed on the street. The doctor explained what happened. And Daniel—" Her throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "He told them to let me die." Alan's expression hardened, though his tone remained professional. "Then we cut him out, permanently." Marjorie drew in a deep breath, her hands clasped in her lap. "Replace him with Grace. She's the only one who showed up. She's the only one who cared." Alan nodded, flipping open a fresh legal pad. His pen scratched against the paper in precise strokes. "Here's what we'll do. We'll revoke your current will, draft a new one naming Grace as the primary beneficiary when she turns 25, and establish a trust that protects the assets until then. And," he glanced up, his eyes sharp with calculation, "we'll add a no contest clause. If Daniel or his wife tries to challenge this, they forfeit everything automatically. It makes any appeal a losing gamble." Marjorie's lips tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't sorrow anymore either. "Good. I don't want him circling me like a vulture. I want him out." Alan leaned back, studying her. "This isn't just about inheritance, is it?" Her gaze drifted to the window, where bare winter branches rattled against the glass. She remembered her son as a boy, running across the yard with scraped knees, needing her for everything. Somewhere along the way, that need had twisted into entitlement. Now he thought her life was his to discard. Her voice was steady when she answered. "This isn't about inheritance. It's about justice." Alan tapped his pen once against the desk, then signed his initials on the draft. "Then let's make it ironclad. You won't just be protecting your money, you'll be protecting your dignity." They spent the next hour reviewing accounts, property deeds, and the modest but carefully managed investments Marjorie had built over decades. Alan's questions were sharp, efficient, but never cold. By the time he slid the draft documents back across the desk, Marjorie felt lighter, as though the ink on those pages had already begun severing her from Daniel's grip. "Once this is signed and witnessed," Alan said, "it goes into the safe deposit box. Only you and I will have access. They'll never touch it." Marjorie exhaled, the tightness in her chest loosening for the first time since the hospital. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I feel like I can breathe again." Alan gave a single, firm nod. "You've taken the first step." And it's the hardest one. When Marjorie left the office, dusk had fallen, the Cleveland sky painted in streaks of purple and gold. She walked to her car slowly, her cane tapping against the pavement in rhythm with her resolve. As she slid into the driver's seat, her phone buzzed in her purse. She pulled it free, expecting a message from Grace. Instead, the screen lit up with Sophie's name. The text glared in the bold letters. "Daniel deserves your estate. Don't be spiteful." Marjorie's thumb hovered over the screen, her pulse pounding. The ink on her new will wasn't dry yet, and already the war had begun. The knock at the door came just after sunset. Marjorie had expected it eventually. The text from Sophie had been a warning shot. She braced herself, smoothed the blanket draped over her lap, and opened the door. Daniel stood on the porch, shoulders stiff, his expression rehearsed into something like concern. Beside him, Sophie wore a polished smile, her perfume carrying into the house before she did. The scent was sharp, synthetic, too sweet. Mom, Daniel said, stepping inside without waiting to be asked. We need to talk. Marjorie closed the door behind them, her cane tapping softly against the hardwood. I imagined you might, she said coolly. They settled into the living room, the glow from the lamp casting uneven shadows across their faces. Sophie perched on the edge of the couch, legs crossed, voice soft and coaxing. Marjorie, you wouldn't punish your own family. Not after everything. Marjorie leaned back in her chair, fingers gripping the carved armrest. Her heartbeat thudded steady, but her voice was even steadier. Punishment isn't my goal. Protection is. Daniel let out a short laugh, cold and humorless. You're old, Mom. It's natural for things to pass down. That's how it's supposed to work. Marjorie's gaze sharpened. And unnatural, she replied, her voice like a blade. For a son to tell a doctor to let his mother die. The words hit harder than she expected. Daniel's face blanched, his jaw tightening as if he'd been slapped. Sophie's polished smile faltered, her eyes darting to the floor for a flicker of a second. Upstairs, out of sight, Grace sat at the top of the staircase. She had slipped her phone into record mode the moment she heard the front door open. Every word, every sneer, every defense, they were all being captured. She watched her father's shoulders stiffen, listened to her grandmother's voice ring with something sharp and unshakable. Daniel cleared his throat, trying to recover. You're twisting things. I was stressed. You don't understand. Marjorie's chin lifted. I understand perfectly. You made yourself clear. And now so will I. Sophie shifted forward, desperation creeping into her tone. Marjorie, think about appearances. Do you really want neighbors, friends, the whole community to know you're cutting out your own son? People will judge you. Marjorie didn't flinch. Let them judge. They weren't the ones left to die in an emergency room while their son dismissed them over the phone. The silence after her words was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Daniel finally stood, his hands balled into fists. You'll regret this, he muttered. When you're gone, people will think you were bitter. They'll think you were unfair. Marjorie rose slowly, her cane grounding her as she stood face to face with him. When I'm gone, Daniel, what they'll think won't matter. What will matter is who I trusted with what I built. And it won't be you. Sophie tugged at Daniel's arm, urging him toward the door. Their exit was sharp, their footsteps clipped against the wooden floor, the slam of the door shaking the picture frames on the wall. Grace crept down the stairs, phone still recording, her expression a mix of triumph and sadness. She handed the device to her grandmother. I got it all, she whispered. Marjorie took the phone, her eyes softening for the first time that evening. Good girl. You shouldn't have had to do this, but it will help. Later that night, she called Alan Pierce. His voice came through the line, calm but edged with satisfaction after she explained what Grace had done. We'll use that if they contest, Alan said. It's not just your word against theirs anymore. It's their own voices, and nothing speaks louder than that. Marjorie set the phone down, the faint echo of her son's arrogance still lingering in the room. She had been accused of being spiteful, but tonight proved the truth. She was prepared. The air in Alan Pierce's office carried the scent of polished wood and ink, a weighty quiet broken only by the scratch of pens and the shuffle of papers. Marjorie sat at the desk, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her cane rested against her chair, but her posture was upright, her eyes focused. Alan slid the final draft toward her. This reflects everything we discussed, he said. Grace is your primary beneficiary once she reaches 25. Daniel and Sophie have been removed entirely, and per your wishes, a portion of your estate will be allocated to the Cleveland Senior Legal Defense Fund. The name printed in bold across the document glimmered like a promise. Marjorie felt the tension in her chest loosen as she read the lines. She imagined Daniel and Sophie sitting in some future lawyer's office, waiting smugly for wealth that would never arrive, only to learn they had been erased. Her voice carried no hesitation. They'll see this as punishment. But it's my survival. Alan leaned back, his gaze steady. You're not punishing them, Marjorie. You're protecting yourself. And you're giving back to a cause that will help people like you who've been targeted." She nodded. He was right. Every word written here wasn't spite. It was justice laid down in legal ink. Grace sat nearby, her notebook open, taking it all in as if watching history being written. She looked at her grandmother with something between awe and relief. "Grandma," she whispered, "this means you're free from him, doesn't it?" Marjorie reached across the table, brushing her granddaughter's hand. "It means he'll never control me again. And neither will she." Alan retrieved a small black binder from his drawer, sliding the pages inside. "This isn't just strong, it's airtight. With the no contest clause, if they even think about fighting it, they risk everything." Marjorie signed her name in careful, deliberate strokes. The sound of pen on paper was steady, final, like the closing of a door that had been left open too long. When the last page was complete, Alan gathered the binder, slipped it into a heavy envelope, and locked it in his briefcase. "I'll place this in the safe deposit box myself this afternoon." "You can rest easy," Marjorie exhaled. A weight she hadn't realized she was carrying finally lifting. "For the first time in weeks," she said softly, "I feel like I've survived something bigger than that hospital." The three of them stood together by the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall in lazy flakes, dusting the parking lot and softening the gray Cleveland skyline. Grace snapped a picture of her grandmother smiling, saying, "This is the face of victory." Marjorie laughed lightly, a sound unburdened for once. "Let's not call it victory just yet. Call it preparation." Alan escorted them to the door, his tone confident. "From now on, the law is on your side. If Daniel or Sophie tries anything, they'll be the ones exposed." The wind cut sharp against Marjorie's cheeks as she and Grace stepped out into the cold, but it no longer stung. She clutched her coat tighter, her heart steadier than it had been in months. She had written her legacy with her own hand, and nothing Daniel could do would undo it, or so she thought. Later that evening, as she sat in her living room sipping chamomile tea, Marjorie opened her laptop to check her bank balance. The familiar login screen flickered, then gave way to numbers that made her stomach twist. Her checking account, short by $5,000. 3 withdrawals in 2 days. Her hand shook as she refreshed the page, praying it was a mistake, but the numbers didn't change. The money was gone. She knew without being told. Daniel. The glow from the screen lit her face, cold and unforgiving. He hadn't even waited for her death. He was already digging. The numbers on the laptop screen stared back at her, merciless and unchanging. Marjorie's heart thudded in her chest, the bitter aftertaste of chamomile still clinging to her tongue. $5,000 gone. She pressed her palm against her sternum, steadying her breath. The cursor blinked on the screen as if mocking her, waiting for her to act. She picked up the phone, the plastic cool against her hand, and dialed her bank. After the endless shuffle of hold music, a representative finally answered. "Mrs. Whitman, can you confirm your date of birth?" She recited it with precision, her voice clipped, her patience thin. "There are unauthorized withdrawals from my account. I need to know who accessed it." The representative's typing clattered faintly in the background. "Yes, ma'am. I see 3 transactions here, all made online, using your login." "That's impossible," Marjorie snapped, her hand tightening around the phone. "I didn't authorize anything." There was a pause. Then the rep spoke carefully. "The IP address used matches a device on file, an address in Shaker Heights. Does that sound familiar?" Marjorie's chest went cold. Daniel's neighborhood. Her voice steadied, though her hands trembled. "Lock everything. Freeze the account." "Yes, ma'am," effective immediately. When she hung up, the silence in the house was deafening. She sank into her armchair, the cushions swallowing her small frame. Anger pushed against her ribs, hot and sharp. For years she had turned a blind eye to the small oddities, the checks Daniel helped her with. The unexplained charges she convinced herself were mistakes. Now, with her eyes finally open, She saw the pattern stretching back further than she wanted to admit. The door creaked open behind her. Grace entered, dropping her backpack by the wall. She spotted the laptop, the tension on her grandmother's face, and froze. "Grandma, what happened?" Marjorie turned the screen toward her. "Look, 5,000. Gone." Grace leaned in, reading the numbers with disbelief before her expression twisted into fury. "Dad?" "Who else?" Marjorie said softly, though the steel in her voice was unmistakable. Grace's fists clenched. "How could he do this to you? After everything?" Marjorie reached out, smoothing a hand over Grace's trembling knuckles. "Because he's been doing it for years. I just wasn't looking." The girl's eyes brimmed, anger and grief warring. "You don't deserve this." "No," Marjorie agreed. "But I will use it. Every dollar he stole is proof of who he really is." The next morning, Marjorie sat in Alan Pierce's office, her laptop balanced on the desk. The attorney scrolled through the bank records she'd printed, his brow furrowed but his mouth set in grim satisfaction. "This is direct evidence," Alan said. "Access logs, timestamps, withdrawals, all tied to him. I'll file a fraud report immediately." Marjorie's voice was calm now, sharpened by resolve. "Do it. If I wanted my money so badly, let him pay for it in court." Alan nodded, already drafting the complaint. "The bank will cooperate. And once law enforcement gets involved, Daniel won't just be a greedy son, he'll be a documented criminal." That evening, the bank confirmed all joint accounts were frozen. Every avenue Daniel once used to siphon funds slammed shut. Marjorie slept better than she had in months, though the weight of betrayal lingered in her chest. 3 days later, a knock rattled her front door. Marjorie stood in the hallway, cane steady in her grip, as Grace hurried past to open it. On the porch stood a sheriff's deputy, his uniform crisp, his presence filling the doorway. In his hand was a folded packet, stamped and sealed. "Is this the residence of Daniel Whitman?" the deputy asked. Marjorie's eyes flickered to the name on the envelope. Bold and undeniable, fraud summons. The deputy gave a short nod. "Consider him served." Grace closed the door slowly, turning to her grandmother with wide eyes. The papers felt heavy between them, but to Marjorie, they weren't a burden. They were justice in progress. The Cuyahoga County Courthouse smelled faintly of floor polish and stale coffee, its marble floors echoing with every step. Marjorie's cane tapped rhythmically as she moved through the security line, Grace at her side like a shadow. Alan Pierce walked slightly ahead, carrying a slim leather briefcase. His calm presence felt like armor. Inside the courtroom, Daniel already sat at the defendant's table. He wore a suit that hung too loose, his tie knotted poorly, his eyes darting around as if searching for sympathy. Sophie perched beside him, sleek in her tailored blazer, her lips pulled into a smug half-smile that dared anyone to question them. When the clerk called the case, Daniel's lawyer rose. His tone was smooth, rehearsed. "Your Honor, what we have here is a family misunderstanding. Mr. Whitman was simply managing his mother's accounts, as he has in the past, with her implied permission." Marjorie's chest tightened, but Alan stood immediately. His voice was steady, deliberate. "Respectfully, Your Honor, the facts contradict that. Mrs. Whitman did not grant her son permission, and we have the records to prove it." He approached the bench, placing a stack of documents in front of the judge. Bank statements showing 3 withdrawals, totaling $5,000, online activity logs tied to Mr. Whitman's device in Shaker Heights, exact timestamps matching when the funds disappeared. Every click he made is documented. The judge flipped through the pages, brow furrowing deeper with each sheet. The quiet hum of the courtroom grew tense. Daniel shifted in his seat, tugging at his collar, sweat visible at his temple. Alan wasn't finished. "We also have testimony confirming Mr. Whitman and his wife pressured Mrs. Whitman for money in her own home, days before these withdrawals occurred. That testimony will establish intent." He gestured toward Grace. She rose slowly, nerves trembling in her legs, but her voice came clear. I was upstairs when they visited. I recorded the conversation. My dad told Grandma she was old and that her money should pass down to him. Sophie said family helps, but they weren't offering help. They were demanding it. Gasps rippled softly through the small crowd in the gallery. Sophie's smug expression collapsed into a scowl. Daniel's knuckles whitened as he gripped the table, glaring at his daughter like she had betrayed him. The judge set the papers down with deliberate care and looked directly at Daniel. "This is theft, not a misunderstanding," Daniel's lawyer sputtered, but the judge's gavel cracked once against the wood, silencing the protest. "Mr. Whitman, you are ordered to make full restitution to your mother. Payment arrangements will be enforced by this court. Any further financial interference will result in harsher penalties." Marjorie inhaled slowly, a measured breath that tasted of vindication. She glanced at Grace, who squeezed her hand under the table, her young fingers strong around her grandmother's. The bailiff dismissed the room, but Sophie didn't wait for formalities. She stood abruptly, her heels clicking furiously against the floor as she stormed out, muttering under her breath. The courtroom doors banged shut behind her, the sound reverberating like a warning. Daniel lingered, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on Marjorie as if he could burn a hole through her resolve. As people filtered out, he leaned closer across the table, his voice low and venomous. "You'll regret cutting me out." Marjorie didn't flinch. She leaned on her cane, stood tall, and met his glare with calm steel. "No, Daniel. The only regret here is yours." Still, his words lingered like smoke, curling into the air as the bailiff called his name, and for the first time, Marjorie realized this wasn't the end of the fight. It was only another round. The hearing room was smaller than the courtroom where restitution had been ordered, but the stakes felt heavier. Marjorie sat at the petitioner's table with Alan Pierce beside her. The smell of old wood and dust thick in the air. Sunlight streamed through high windows, striping the room in pale gold. Across the aisle, Daniel leaned forward with his lawyer whispering into his ear. His suit was pressed this time, his hair slicked back, but no polish could mask the bitterness etched into his face. Sophie sat behind him, scrolling on her phone with an air of practiced indifference. The clerk called the case. Daniel's lawyer stood first. "Your Honor, we are challenging the validity of Mrs. Whitman's recently executed will. We contend she was not of sound mind when she signed it. Advanced age, recent medical distress, this all points to incompetence." Marjorie's jaw tightened, her cane resting across her lap like a quiet weapon. She turned her gaze to Alan, who rose with calm precision. "Your Honor," Alan said, placing a folder neatly on the bench. "We anticipated this baseless attack. Here is a physician's evaluation dated the day before Mrs. Whitman executed her new estate documents. It states, in no uncertain terms, that she was competent, lucid, and fully aware of her decisions." The judge adjusted her glasses, flipping through the letter signed in bold ink by Dr. Harris Cole. The courtroom fell silent except for the rustle of paper. Alan continued, his voice cutting clean. "And to ensure clarity, Doctor, Cole is here to testify." The bailiff opened the side door, and Dr. Cole entered, his white coat traded for a dark suit, but the authority in his posture unchanged. He took the stand, swore in, and looked directly at the judge. "I was the physician who treated Mrs. Whitman when she collapsed on Euclid Avenue," he began. His tone carried both clinical precision and personal conviction. Not only was she lucid during her recovery, but she was fully capable of making complex decisions. I evaluated her myself before she met with Mr. Pierce. She understood the contents of her will, asked sharp questions, and demonstrated clear reasoning. Daniel shifted in his seat, color draining from his face. Dr. Cole's expression hardened. "And I will add this. I was also the physician who called her son that night in the ER. His response was, and I quote, 'Let her die.' That moment made it painfully clear why Mrs. Whitman sought to protect herself." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Daniel's lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. The statement goes to motive. It stands. The nurse who had been on duty that night was called next. She walked briskly to the stand, her scrubs still faintly smelling of antiseptic, her face set with quiet outrage. I heard every word of that phone call. No one twisted it. He said it like he meant it. She looked toward Daniel, her eyes hard. And I'll never forget it. Daniel lowered his gaze, avoiding the weight of her testimony. Sophie shifted uneasily in her seat, the indifference slipping for the first time. The judge tapped her pen once against the folder before speaking. The evidence is clear. The evaluation shows Mrs. Whitman was competent. The testimony confirms her intentions. This appeal is dismissed with prejudice. She leaned forward, her voice firm. Mr. Whitman, do not waste this court's time again. The gavel cracked, final and resonant. Relief coursed through Marjorie's chest, warm and grounding. Grace, sitting behind her, leaned forward and whispered, "He's done, Grandma. He can't touch you anymore." Marjorie reached for her granddaughter's hand, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "No, sweetheart. He's finished, but the war wasn't over." That evening, as Marjorie settled into her quiet home, her phone buzzed with a notification. Grace brought it to her with wide eyes. On social media, Sophie's latest post burned across the screen. Her own mother is abusing her, cutting her son out, stealing from her family. Shameful. The words spread like wildfire, pulling their private war into public view. By morning, Grace's phone was buzzing nonstop. Friends sent her screenshots. Classmates tagged her in neighborhood threads. Sophie's words had spread far and wide, twisting the story. Her own mother is abusing her, cutting her son out, stealing from her family. Shameful. Grace paced the length of the living room, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the hardwood. "Grandma, people are believing it. She's making you out to be some greedy old woman. It's all over my feeds." Marjorie sat still in her armchair, her cane resting against her knee, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. Her face didn't flinch. "Let them chatter," she said softly. "The truth doesn't whisper. It roars when you put it in the right hands." That afternoon, she met Alan Pierce at his office. The smell of brewed coffee and paper hung in the air as he leaned over his desk, Sophie's post glowing on his computer screen. He let out a humorless chuckle. "They wanted an audience. Then let's give them one." Marjorie raised an eyebrow. "You mean go public?" Alan slid a folder across the desk. It was thick with evidence, bank statements with highlighted withdrawals, login histories tied directly to Daniel's device, affidavits from Dr. Cole and the ER nurse. "We won't fight with insults, Marjorie. We'll fight with evidence. If Sophie wants to play in the court of public opinion, we'll show that opinion every ugly fact they tried to bury." The following day, a reporter from the Plain Dealer sat at Marjorie's kitchen table. The air smelled of cinnamon rolls Grace had baked nervously that morning, their sweetness clashing with the tension in the room. The reporter leaned forward, voice recorder placed carefully between them. "I never wanted this to be public," Marjorie began, her voice steady but tinged with weariness. "But when my son told a doctor to let me die, when he stole from my accounts, silence stopped being survival. The only way to protect myself was to speak." Alan handed over the documents. The reporter's pen scratched furiously, the weight of each detail thickening the story. 2 days later, the headline hit Cleveland's front page. "Retired woman defends estate against family exploitation." Beneath it was a photo of Marjorie standing with Grace outside Alan's office. Grace's arm was looped through her grandmother's, their faces resolute. The article detailed Daniel's theft, Sophie's smear post, and the court rulings in Marjorie's favor. Quotes from Dr. Cole and the nurse corroborated everything. The truth wasn't whispered anymore, it roared. At Daniel's office downtown, whispers replaced handshakes. Colleagues passed the paper across cubicles, eyes flicking toward him with thinly veiled judgment. By Friday, his supervisor summoned him into a glass-walled office. The blinds stayed open as if to make an example of him. This company cannot be associated with fraud or elder exploitation, the supervisor said flatly. You're terminated. Effective immediately, Daniel's protest fell flat. He carried his box of belongings out past co-workers who avoided his eyes, humiliation burning hotter than the winter wind outside. Meanwhile, Sophie faced her own unraveling. The same neighbors who once flocked to her brunches crossed the street to avoid her. At the grocery store, women whispered behind their carts. A cashier who once chatted easily now rang up her order in silence, jaw tight. The judgment was relentless, and Sophie, once so polished, could feel herself shrinking beneath it. Back at Marjorie's, Grace sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through comments beneath the article. Her grin widened with each one. Listen to this, Grandma. Finally, someone standing up to greedy kids. And this one, she's an inspiration. Marjorie allowed herself a rare smile. The vindication wasn't in revenge. It was in exposure. They called me spiteful. Now the whole city knows the truth. Grace looked up from her phone, her eyes shining. They're the ones embarrassed now. Marjorie rested her hand over Grace's, the firelight warming their joined fingers. Good, I don't need to embarrass them. I just needed to survive them. But as the fire crackled and the article circulated across Cleveland, another blow landed. A letter slid into Marjorie's mailbox, a notice from Daniel's employer. Grace read it aloud, her voice a mix of shock and awe. Grandma, it says he's been officially terminated. No severance, Marjorie leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time in months, the scales tipped completely. Daniel had tried to destroy her. Instead, he had destroyed himself. The lecture hall at Cleveland State University buzzed with quiet excitement. Rows of students leaned forward in their seats, notebooks open, while faculty members whispered in small clusters near the podium. A banner stretched across the stage. The Marjorie Whitman Scholarship for Counseling Students, launch event. Marjorie stood just off stage, smoothing her blazer with steady hands. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and brewed coffee from the catering table in the corner. Grace adjusted the microphone stand, her bright eyes brimming with pride. Grandma, she whispered. They're here for you. You're making history, Marjorie gave a wry smile. I never thought I'd see my name on a banner that wasn't tied to my obituary. That alone makes this worth it. When she stepped up to the podium, the room quieted. Her cane clicked once against the hardwood, and then she looked out at the sea of young faces. I spent 40 years as a school counselor, she began. Her voice carried not just through the microphone, but through every attentive ear. I sat across from children who were frightened, angry, lost. I learned that listening is as powerful as speaking. That's why I believe in investing in the future of counselors, because this work saves lives in silence every day. A ripple of applause swept through the hall. Marjorie let it settle before continuing. This scholarship isn't just money, she said, her tone sharpening. It's defiance. My son thought my life was his inheritance to claim. He thought my death was a payday. Instead, my life will fund yours. My legacy will be knowledge, compassion, and resilience, not greed. The applause rose louder, echoing off the walls. Students clapped, professors nodded, and Grace, standing to the side, wiped at her eyes. Afterward, reporters snapped photos as Marjorie stood flanked by Grace and Alan Pierce. The attorney's voice was low but firm as he leaned toward her. Your name is iron now. They can't bend it, can't tarnish it. Every article that smeared you is buried under this. Marjorie's gaze lingered on the banner one last time before she answered. And his name is Ash. That's all that's left. Grace threw her arms around her grandmother, hugging tight enough to make Marjorie's cane clatter softly against the stage floor. I'm so proud of you, Grace whispered. Be proud of us, Marjorie corrected gently. Because you stood with me. The event ended with applause and laughter, the kind of noise that hummed with hope. Marjorie left with flowers in her arms, cameras flashing behind her, and a sense of victory that settled not in her ego but in her bones. For the first time, she felt untouchable. That illusion cracked later that evening. The sun had long since set, and the neighborhood was quiet except for the faint crunch of ice-melted snow under tires. Marjorie sat in her living room, the scholarship plaque leaning against the wall waiting to be hung. Grace was upstairs, her voice faintly audible as she chatted with a friend. A knock rattled the front door, slow, heavy, insistent. Marjorie rose carefully, cane in hand, her heart picking up a pace she hadn't felt since court. She opened the door, and there he was. Daniel stood on her porch, his suit wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, the smell of stale liquor clinging to him. His face was haggard, desperation etched into every line. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "Please, I need to talk to you." Marjorie gripped her cane tighter, the chill from the winter air brushing past her into the warmth of her home. The man who had once been her son looked less like family now, and more like a stranger begging at the edge of her life. "Mom, please," Daniel's voice cracked as he stood in the doorway, hands twitching as if he didn't know whether to reach out or shove them in his pockets. "I made a mistake." Marjorie held her ground just inside the frame, the warm glow of her living room behind her and the winter air seeping in around him. Her cane was steady against the floor, her voice steady against him. "You told a doctor to let me die." Daniel flinched like she'd struck him. "I didn't mean it like that. I was under pressure. Work, money." Sophie's voice cut in before he could finish. She stepped into the porch light, mascara smudged, her expression brittle. "We didn't mean it literally, Marjorie." Your twisting words said in stress. "Families fight. They say things." Marjorie's eyes narrowed. "Families fight, yes, but families don't sentence each other." The stairs creaked behind her, and Grace came down, her phone still in her hand from a late-night call upstairs. She planted herself beside her grandmother, shoulders square, voice steady. "I heard you. You meant it." Both of you, Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel's breath clouded in the cold air, harsh and shallow. "We've lost everything," he blurted. His voice was louder now, urgent, almost feral. "The house, my job, they've taken it all. You're all we've got left. Please just help us." Marjorie studied him for a long moment, her silence heavier than any words. His tie hung loose, his face gaunt, his eyes darting between her and the warm living room he no longer belonged to. She thought of the scholarship banner, the applause at the university, the letters that would one day arrive from students carrying her name forward. Then she thought of his voice echoing in that hospital corridor. "Let her die." Her jaw set. "There's no space for you in my will." "There never will be," the words landed like a gavel. Daniel's hands dropped to his sides. For a moment, his face softened into raw defeat, then twisted back into rage. Sophie grabbed his arm, whispering furiously, "Come on, Daniel, don't beg." But Daniel's voice snapped out, louder now, his composure gone. "You'll regret this, Mom. Everyone will see what you've done." Marjorie's hand tightened around the door frame, but her gaze never wavered. Calmly, deliberately, she began to close the door. "I regret nothing except giving you more chances than you deserved." The latch clicked into place, muting their voices into muffled echoes on the porch. The house settled into silence again, broken only by the faint crackle of the fireplace. Grace leaned against the wall, breathing hard, then looked at her grandmother with wide, proud eyes. "You ended it," Grace whispered. Marjorie exhaled, lowering herself into her chair. "I ended the begging, but ending him, that takes the law." 3 days later, Alan's call confirmed it. His voice came crisp over the line. "Daniel's filed one last motion. Desperate, flimsy, but he's trying to drag this through court again." Marjorie's hand tightened around the receiver, her cane tapping once against the floor. Her son had begged at her door, but now he was back to claws and teeth, scratching at the last threads he could grab. The courtroom air was dry, tinged with the faint scent of old paper and the buzzing hum of fluorescent lights. Marjorie sat, straight-backed at the petitioner's table, her cane leaning against her chair, her face composed but sharp. Beside her, Alan Pierce shuffled neatly stacked documents into precise order, every sheet a nail ready for Daniel's legal coffin. Across the aisle, Daniel leaned in to whisper furiously to his lawyer, his gestures wild, his face splotched red. Sophie sat a step behind him, mascara streaking faintly beneath her eyes as if she hadn't slept. She fiddled with her wedding ring, twisting it so hard her knuckles whitened. The clerk called the case, and the judge, stern, middle-aged, and already irritated by the stack of filings, peered over her glasses. "Mr. Whitman, this is your third motion contesting your mother's will. The last two were dismissed with prejudice. Why should I hear this one?" Daniel's lawyer stood, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, we believe new grounds exist." Before he could continue, Alan rose, his voice calm but cutting. "Your Honor, this is harassment. Each time Mr. Whitman files, he rehashes the same baseless claims. My client is elderly. This is not only a waste of her time, it is abuse of the court system." The judge frowned. "Mr. Pierce, proceed." Alan stepped forward, placing a binder on the bench. Inside are every document and recording that rebuts Mr. Whitman's claims. Bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals. A transcript of the audio recording where Mr. Whitman and his wife pressured Mrs. Whitman for money. Medical evaluations affirming her competency when the will was signed. And sworn testimony from both Dr. Harris Cole and Nurse Elaine Marks, who heard Mr. Whitman's infamous directive in the ER, "Let her die." The words rang across the courtroom, heavy enough to silence the shuffling of papers. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his lawyer fumbling to object, but the judge waved him down. Sophie suddenly rose from her seat, her voice trembling as tears spilled over. "Please, Your Honor, he's not a monster. He's just lost. He's our only child's father. We've suffered enough humiliation." The judge cut her off, voice cool and unwavering. "Mrs. Whitman, sit down. This court does not weigh crocodile tears against documented theft and fraud." The sound of Sophie collapsing back into her seat, sobbing quietly into her hands, filled the quiet room. Daniel glared at his mother, his jaw tightening so hard it seemed it might crack. The judge leaned forward, pen tapping against her notes. "Mr. Whitman, I am dismissing this motion in its entirety. Furthermore, if you file another frivolous claim, I will impose sanctions, monetary penalties, possibly even contempt. You are harassing your mother, and I will not allow this court to be used as your weapon." Her gavel cracked against the bench, sharp and final. The echo lingered in the air, heavy with finality. Marjorie exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing against the polished wood of her con. Grace leaned in from behind, whispering into her ear. "It's over, Grandma. He can't hurt you anymore." Marjorie turned slightly, meeting her granddaughter's eyes. A small, weary smile crossed her lips. "Yes, for me, it's over. For him, it's just beginning." The courtroom emptied in fragments. Sophie stumbled out first, her sobs echoing faintly down the marble hallway. Daniel trailed behind, his lawyer trying in vain to calm him as he muttered under his breath, eyes darting with venom toward Marjorie. Marjorie didn't watch him leave. She stood steady on her cane and walked out beside Alan and Grace. The marble floor gleamed beneath the overhead lights, her reflection faint but certain, an image of a woman who had refused to break. 3 days later, a plain white envelope arrived in her mailbox. Grace tore it open at the kitchen table, scanning quickly before her eyes widened. "Grandma," she whispered, handing the paper across. Marjorie read the notice slowly, each line deliberate. Wage garnishment order. Restitution enforced. Daniel's paycheck, what little remained of it, would now bleed back into her account until every stolen dollar was repaid. She set the paper down, the corners curling slightly against the oak tabletop. Justice wasn't always swift, but tonight it had a face, and it was her son's unraveling. The garnishment notice wasn't just paper. It was a slow bleed. Each week, Daniel's paycheck shrank, the court siphoning money back into the accounts he had stolen from. The numbers didn't lie. His wages dwindled, his debts ballooned, and his credit tanked like a stone dropped in Lake Erie. Bill collectors began circling. Letters piled on his kitchen table, bold red stamps shouting delinquent and final notice. The hum of his phone became a constant irritation, each buzz another creditor demanding what he couldn't give. Sophie tried to hold on at first. She made excuses to her friends, kept her chin high at the grocery store. But whispers followed her down every aisle, neighbors turning away with sharp little glances. Her pride cracked faster than her patience. One evening, as snow flurried outside their small rental, she stood in the living room with her suitcase open. Her voice was tight, low, but steady. "I can't do this anymore, Daniel. I didn't marry you to live in humiliation." He lurched toward her, eyes bloodshot, desperation clinging to his words. "Sophie, please, don't go. We'll fix it. I'll appeal again. She cut him off with a shake of her head. The judge threatened sanctions. "Your name's ruined, and mine's ruined with it. I won't sink beside you." The slam of the suitcase latch was final. The door followed, closing with a dull thud that reverberated in the hollow house. Daniel sat on the couch, hands gripping his knees, the silence louder than her footsteps fading down the sidewalk. By spring, eviction notices arrived. The landlord, tired of excuses and bounced checks, posted a bright orange paper on the front door. Daniel tore it down, crumpled it in his fists, but the deadline stamped in black ink didn't vanish. 2 weeks later, movers carried his belongings to the curb, the cold sun glaring on every box. He watched from the porch, jaw clenched, humiliation biting deeper than the wind. Grace heard about it through whispers at her college campus. A friend texted her a photo. Daniel standing by a pile of boxes, face gaunt, hair unkempt, the image of defeat. She stared at it for a long time, conflicted. Pity tugged at the corners of her chest, but anger rooted her where she stood. She saved the photo, not for sympathy, but as proof of consequence. That weekend, Grace sat with Marjorie at the kitchen table. The house was warm, the smell of stew bubbling on the stove wrapping around them. She slid her phone across the table, the picture glowing on the screen. Marjorie looked at it quietly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "He dug this hole," she said finally, her voice calm, almost sad. "I just stopped filling it in." Alan Pierce stopped by later that evening, briefcase in hand, coat dusted with snow. He set new documents on the table, final confirmations of the garnishments, the restitution payments, the sanctions ready to enforce if Daniel dared another motion. His tone was firm, but his eyes softened toward Marjorie. "You left him broke and erased," Alan said. "Legally, financially, publicly, he's finished." Marjorie leaned back in her chair, her cane propped neatly beside her. "Good. Because I can't carry him anymore, and I won't." The words weren't bitter. They were resolute, almost weary. She had buried her grief long ago. Now she was simply protecting what was left. Later that night, as the wind howled against the windows, Marjorie shuffled through her mail. Bills, flyers, a catalog, then a slim envelope with careful handwriting. She slid it open with her thumb, unfolding a letter written in neat blue ink. "Dear Mrs. Whitman," it began. "I'm the first recipient of your scholarship. I just wanted to thank you. You've given me a chance I never thought I'd have." Her hands trembled as she read, the words spilling hope and gratitude across the page. Grace came into the room, and Marjorie passed her the letter silently. The girl read, her smile widening, her eyes shining. For the first time in years, Marjorie felt a warmth that wasn't tied to money, power, or loss. It was tied to giving, to leaving something bigger than herself. The letter ended with a simple line, "You changed my future." Marjorie held it to her chest, the fire crackling in the hearth. Her son had been erased, but her legacy had just begun to breathe. The spring air carried the scent of lilacs from the fence line as Marjorie knelt in her backyard, her knees cushioned by an old pad. The sun was warm on her shoulders, soft against the brim of her straw hat. She pressed her hands into the earth, cool and damp, planting marigold seedlings with deliberate care, each root covered, each stem upright. It was the quiet order she craved. Behind her, Grace's voice floated from the patio chair where she sat with a stack of envelopes. "Another one came in today," Grace said, unfolding a letter with careful fingers. "This student's from Toledo." First in her family to go to college, Marjorie wiped her brow with the back of her glove, leaning on her cane as she turned. To listen, Grace read aloud, her voice animated. "Your generosity gave me hope when I felt invisible. You made me believe I can finish my degree. Thank you for investing in someone you've never even met." The words filled the yard, mingling with birdsong and the steady hum of bees nosing through blossoms. Marjorie smiled, her chest swelling with something more lasting than relief. Purpose. "This," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "This is my legacy. Not money in a bank. Not family who only waited for me to die. This is what I'll leave behind." Grace set the letter down and came to kneel beside her, wrapping an arm gently around her grandmother's shoulders. "And it's beautiful. They'll never forget what you did." A crunch of gravel from the driveway drew their attention. Dr. Harris Cole approached, dressed in weekend clothes instead of hospital scrubs, a paper bag of fresh bread from a local bakery in his hand. His smile was warm but edged with seriousness. "Afternoon, Marjorie," he said. "Garden looks good." "Good therapy," she answered, standing slowly with Grace's help. "Better than anything they sell in bottles." Dr. Cole chuckled, then grew quiet, his eyes softening. "I'm glad you didn't listen to his words that day. Some people would have given up hearing what you heard. But you fought back." Marjorie looked at him for a long moment, the spring breeze tugging gently at the edges of her hat. "I had to. If I'd believed him, if I'd let those words sink too deep, I'd already be gone." Grace stepped forward, her chin high. She's stronger than all of them put together. Stronger than Dad, stronger than Sophie, stronger than every single lie they told. The three stood in the garden for a beat of silence, the sunlight painting everything in soft gold. For a fleeting moment, the world felt right, safe, rooted, and full of possibility. Later that evening, as dusk folded over the neighborhood and fireflies began to blink in the grass, Marjorie settled into her living room armchair with Grace curled beside her. They sipped tea and watched the fire dance in the hearth. Letters from scholarship students spread out on the coffee table like trophies. The mail sat unopened on the side table. Grace reached over to sort through it, humming softly. Bills, a gardening catalog, then a plain white envelope, no return address. She handed it to Marjorie with a frown. "Weird one. Looks heavy." Marjorie slid it open with her thumb, pulling out a single sheet. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, and unmistakably familiar. "You'll die alone." The words leapt off the page, stark and venomous. Grace gasped. He sent that." Marjorie folded the letter carefully, her face unreadable. The fire popped in the hearth, embers crackling like quiet applause for a battle still unfinished. She slipped the note back into the envelope, setting it aside without a tremor. "I've faced worse than his words," she murmured. But even as she said it, she knew this wasn't just a threat. It was his last weapon, poison dropped in ink. And though she wouldn't show it, the echo of his bitterness lingered in the quiet house, as if daring her to prove him wrong. The letter crackled as it touched the flame, edges curling into black lace before collapsing into glowing ash. Marjorie stood before the fireplace, the warmth kissing her cheeks, the bitter ink dissolving into nothing. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. That threat, like all his others, had no place in her home. Grace hovered nearby, her fists clenched as if she could tear the words apart herself. When the last corner of the paper turned to ember and vanished into the blaze, Grace exhaled in relief. "Good riddance," she muttered. Marjorie turned, her expression calm but resolute. Some things don't deserve to be saved. Not even as reminders. The next morning, sunlight poured through the dining room windows as Marjorie unpacked a long rectangular box. Inside lay the polished plaque for the Marjorie Whitman Scholarship Fund. Engraved with her name in crisp, bold letters, Grace helped her lift it carefully from the packaging, the gold trim catching the light like a beacon. "Where should it go?" Grace asked, holding it steady in her hands. Marjorie tapped her cane against the wall above the mantel. "Right there, front and center. Let it watch over the room they hung it together," the metal gleaming proudly against the soft cream paint. Around it, Marjorie pinned photos she had received from scholarship recipients. Smiling young faces, diplomas clutched in hand, eyes full of hope. The wall became a collage of futures she had touched, lives she had steered toward possibility. Grace stepped back, admiring the display. "It's beautiful. It looks like a family tree." Marjorie's lips curved into a soft smile. "That's exactly what it is. My family. Chosen by action, not blood." Grace slipped her arms around her grandmother, hugging tight. "You'll never be alone, Grandma. Not with me. Not with them." For the first time in years, Marjorie let her guard drop, allowing herself to rest in the embrace. She inhaled deeply, the scent of Grace's shampoo, lavender, and honey, mixing with the faint charred smell still lingering from the burned letter. The contrast struck her. Bitterness turned to ash, legacy turned to gold. Later, as the house grew quiet, Marjorie settled at the kitchen table with her binder of estate documents. The pages were neat, the tabs color-coded, every clause airtight thanks to Alan's meticulous work. She traced her finger along the title page, feeling not anxiety but control. Her son's name was nowhere within these pages. Instead, there were lines for Grace, provisions for the scholarship, instructions for a legacy defined by choice. She closed the binder and placed it on the shelf, where it stood, beside cookbooks and photo albums, not as a burden, but as another record of her life carefully lived. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows on the wall where her plaque gleamed above the photos. Grace curled on the couch, half asleep under a blanket, her breathing soft and steady. Marjorie sat back in her armchair, the cane resting across her lap, and let her thoughts circle back to where it had all begun. On a cold Cleveland street, her body collapsing, her son's voice sentencing her. Her breath came steady now, free of fear, and her lips parted with a final truth she spoke not to him, but for herself. "I collapsed on the street. The doctor called my son, and he said, 'Let her die.' So I made sure he died broke in my will.